the lights go out and history grows quiet, the stories that were never meant to be told begin to breathe. Tonight, we step into America's silent chapters, moments buried, ignored, or deliberately forgotten. These are not loud battles or famous speeches, but the soft, unsettling truths that shaped a nation in the shadows. If you find meaning in calm, dark history told gently, subscribe now and let these hidden stories guide you into the night. History, as it is often told, is like a photograph taken under bright sunlight, clear, sharp, and filled with details that fit neatly into the frame. Yet the darker corners, the spaces where shadows linger, are rarely shown. These are the events that did not make the textbooks, moments carefully minimized, altered, or erased altogether. They are the silent whispers of America's past, stories of hardship, injustice, and quiet rebellion that never found a stage. To explore them is to step into a different rhythm of time, a slower, almost imperceptible pulse where the consequences of power and neglect are felt more than they are loudly proclaimed. Consider the story of the native nations. For centuries, children are taught about pilgrims and the founding of America in terms of heroism and discovery. Yet very few textbooks dwell on the slow, systematic erasure of entire cultures, the forced relocations, the stolen lands, and the diseases brought that wiped out populations before most had even grasped the concept of resistance. These are the histories that exist in whispers, treaties broken silently, villages abandoned, languages disappearing under the weight of enforced assimilation. There were no dramatic battles in the headlines, but every stolen field, every emptied village, spoke volumes about a nation built in part upon silence and omission. And it was not only the early colonial periods that were veiled. Even into the 20th century, many dark moments went quietly unnoticed by the general public. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, for example, was once omitted from school textbooks for decades. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a thriving black community was destroyed overnight. Hundreds were killed, thousands left homeless, and yet for years, this event remained unspoken in classrooms, absent in libraries, and almost erased from collective memory. The narrative told in textbooks often celebrated progress and growth, while the voices of the victims were muted. It is this selective memory, this careful crafting of history, that allowed certain powerful narratives to dominate, making some Americans the heroes of a story and others invisible in it. Labor history, too, has its silent chapters. Early industrial America witnessed countless tragedies that shaped the modern workplace but were rarely recorded in the celebratory pages of progress. Consider the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. Over 100 young women died because of unsafe working conditions. Their deaths could have led to widespread outrage, but in the years that followed, the focus remained on reformers and legislation, while the daily lives of the workers, their dress, their struggles, the communities they supported, faded into the background. History told the laws that were passed, the changes implemented, but left out the human cost that made those changes necessary. Even moments of national expansion carry quiet shadows. Westward expansion is often framed as a story of bravery and opportunity, of pioneers venturing into untamed land. Yet this framing leaves out the countless lives disrupted, the small villages erased, and the ecosystems destroyed. Native communities were forced into confined reservations, their traditions suppressed, while settlers were celebrated for their courage and determination. In the textbooks, maps show neat lines of states and territories. What they do not show is the silent suffering etched into those lands. The whisper, pleas that went unheard, the families torn apart by policies designed for conquest rather than coexistence. Silent chapters also extend into the realm of social movements. The history of women's rights, for instance, is often condensed to a few landmark events: the Seneca Falls Convention, the passage of the 19th Amendment. Yet the decades of quiet activism, of local organizing, of women facing harassment, ridicule, and exclusion often go unmentioned. The story of how ordinary women risked everything in towns and cities across the country is largely absent from the mainstream narrative. Those who did not survive to see victory, whose voices were never published or recorded, are omitted, creating a historical silence that can feel deafening. Education itself has been a tool of omission. Curriculum decisions, school boards, and textbook committees shape the version of history that reaches young minds. Often, events are simplified or sanitized to present a sense of national pride or cohesion. Topics that might provoke discomfort: systemic racism, the exploitation of workers, displacement of indigenous peoples, are minimized, footnoted, or excised. As a result, entire generations grow up with a story of America that is incomplete, one where light dominates and darkness is reduced to a shadowy footnote. This act of minimizing history is not always deliberate in a sinister sense. Sometimes it is a product of convenience, fear, or the desire to avoid conflict. Yet the effect is the same: a partial memory, a skewed understanding of the past. People remember triumphs and ignore tragedies, celebrate progress while forgetting the price paid. This silence, though, is powerful. It shapes identity, policy, and perception. It allows injustices to be repeated, because lessons unlearned are lessons repeated. And for those who lived through these events, the workers, the marginalized communities, the forgotten voices, history's silence can feel like betrayal, even the language of his. Tory plays a role in erasure. Terms like settlers rather than invaders, industrial growth rather than worker exploitation, progress rather than displacement, subtly shape perception. These choices, seemingly small, accumulate over time to create a narrative that favors power and diminishes suffering. Silent chapters exist not only in what is omitted, but in how stories are told. In books, in classrooms, in monuments and memorials, and even in casual conversation, the framing of events can obscure as much as it reveals. To explore these silent chapters is to listen carefully. One must read between the lines, seek out the letters, diaries, and newspapers that were ignored, and pay attention to the lives of ordinary people. It is to notice the spaces left blank on maps, the names absent from official records, and the communities that never received acknowledgement. In doing so, history becomes not only a story of what happened, but also of what was, nearly hidden. It is a meditation on absence, on quiet suffering, and on resilience that endured despite neglect. As the decades passed, the silent chapters of America's history did not vanish. They merely settled into the corners of collective memory, waiting to be uncovered. The 20th century brought technological progress, industrial growth, and global conflicts. Yet, alongside these stories of triumph were countless moments of quiet tragedy, overlooked or intentionally forgotten. Take, for instance, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Over 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, were forcibly relocated to camps in remote areas simply because of their ancestry. In school textbooks, this period is often condensed to a single paragraph, if mentioned at all. Yet, within those barbed wire fences, people lived lives interrupted, dreams deferred, and families fractured. Children missed school, adults lost livelihoods, and entire communities were stigmatized. The narrative in most history books focuses on patriotism and wartime strategy, while the human cost, the quiet despair, the resilience of those interned, remains largely in the shadows. Similarly, the story of labor movements continued to unfold in ways often ignored. Strikes, protests, and union battles shaped the nation's workforce, but their details were frequently omitted from mainstream accounts. Consider the coal wars of the early 1900s, in which miners organized to demand safer conditions and fair pay. Armed conflicts erupted between miners and private security forces. Families lived in fear, communities were destroyed, and the courage of those workers rarely made it into textbooks. By presenting history as a series of legislative wins or industrial milestones, the voices of those who endured the suffering became nearly invisible. The civil rights movement offers another glimpse into the selective memory of history. The speeches of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. are immortal. Yet countless smaller acts of courage by ordinary people often go unrecorded. Local activists faced harassment, jail time, or worse, their names absent from the history books that chronicled the broader movement. Silent chapters are present in these overlooked struggles: the women who organize voter registration drives in the Deep South, the teachers who risked their jobs to educate Black Sea children, the families who endured bombings and boycotts. These stories carry the same weight as the iconic moments, yet remain quietly tucked away, waiting for those who seek them. Even in the realm of political history, silence has a presence. Decisions made in back rooms, policies passed without public debate, and covert programs often escape the pages of textbooks. The Tuskegee syphilis study, for example, lasted for decades, with scientists observing untreated disease in African American men without consent. It was not a single catastrophic event in public view, but a slow, methodical exploitation of trust and ignorance quietly conducted under the authority of the government. Such stories remind us that omission is not only about what is left out, it is also about who is allowed to be seen and who is not. Economic history, too, carries silent chapters. The Great Depression, while widely discussed, is often framed through stock market crashes, bank failures, and New Deal programs. Yet beneath the surface were millions of lives upended, families living in shantytowns, children going hungry, and communities forced to adapt in unimaginable ways. The textbooks tell us about legislation and recovery, but rarely about the lived experience of those struggling, the day-to-day reality of poverty, and the quiet dignity with which people persevered. These are the chapters that never make it to the official narrative, yet they are integral to understanding the full scope of history. The arts and media, too, have played a role in both recording and obscuring history. Newspapers, film, and literature often amplified the stories society wanted to hear, while silencing those that challenged comfortable narratives. Stories of marginalized communities were underrepresented, misrepresented, or ignored. Photographs of protests were sometimes censored. Books were banned or went out of print. By controlling what is published and preserved, history itself became selective, leaving in fragments of truth rather than a complete picture. The effect of these omissions is profound. History shapes identity, informs policy, and teaches lessons for the future. When certain events are minimized or erased, society loses the opportunity to fully learn from the past. The silent chapters of America's history are not just relics of bygone times, they are active influences on the present. They reveal patterns of injustice, resilience, and resistance that continue to echo today. Understanding them is crucial for anyone seeking to grasp the true complexity of the nation's story. Yet discovering these hidden chapters is not impossible. Letters, diaries, oral histories, and archival records provide glimpses into the lives that mainstream history overlooks. Local museums, independent historians, and community storytellers preserve narratives that defy erasure. By listening to these voices, by giving attention to those who were previously ignored, we begin to reconstruct a fuller, more honest picture of the past. The act of remembering becomes an act of justice, honoring the lives that history almost forgot. As we reflect on these silent chapters, it is also important to recognize the subtlety of omission. History is not always silent in dramatic ways. Sometimes it is in the details never emphasized, the footnotes rarely read, or the maps drawn without acknowledging the displacement beneath them. Learning to notice absence, to read between the lines, is as vital as studying what is explicitly recorded. In doing so, we cultivate awareness, empathy, and a deeper understanding of the human experience across time. Ultimately, the history that didn't make the textbooks challenges us to reconsider the narratives we accept. It invites us to question whose stories are told, whose are silenced, and why. These chapters, though quiet, are powerful. They teach us that progress is rarely linear, that injustice often persists in subtle forms, and that the lives of ordinary people are as significant as the deeds of the famous. As we close our reflection on these silent chapters, we recognize that history is not only what we see in textbooks or hear in classrooms. It is the accumulation of countless small moments, the overlooked struggles, the erased voices, and the quiet resistance that endured despite neglect. By seeking out these stories, by acknowledging what was almost hidden, We honor the full complexity of the past and bring light to the shadows. The dark corners of history are no longer merely silent. They are remembered, understood, and felt. And in remembering, there is a quiet hope that future generations might inherit a fuller, richer, and more truthful story of America, one that does not shy away from the shadows, but embraces them as part of the nation's soul. These silent chapters, once hidden, now speak, and their echoes remind us that history is never truly complete until every voice has been heard. History often speaks loudly through the achievements of a few, the victories of the powerful, or the grand narratives that textbooks emphasize. But beneath these bold stories lies a quiet world, one filled with voices that were silenced, company, communities that were overlooked, and lives that went unrecorded. These are the individuals whose suffering was never acknowledged, the workers whose labor built empires yet left them invisible, and the ordinary people whose daily struggles remain absent from official records. To listen to these voices is to walk gently into the spaces where history whispers rather than shouts. Consider the lives, the laborers during the rise of industrial America. The factories, mills, and mines that drove the economy forward were staffed by thousands of ordinary men, women, and children. Yet their stories are rarely told in full. Children as young as 10 or 12 worked long hours in dangerous conditions, their small hands bruised and calloused, their bodies exhausted before they had even reached adulthood. Women in factories labored not only to earn wages, but to support families left destitute by economic hardship. In the history books, industrial progress is often celebrated with diagrams of machinery, timelines of production, and accounts of efficiency. What is left unsaid are the silent cries, the whispered fatigue, the lives constrained by relentless labor. Their suffering, while immense, was rendered invisible by the march of progress. Communities of immigrants faced similar erasure. In bustling cities, neighborhoods of Italian, Irish, Chinese, and other immigrant groups grew. Yet their hardships were often ignored by mainstream society. Children learned English in overcrowded schools, while their parents endured harsh working conditions, meager wages, and social prejudice. Disease spread quickly in cramped tenements, and accidents at workplaces were common. Newspapers occasionally reported tragic events, but rarely did the narratives delve into the lived experience of these families, the quiet courage required to survive, or the subtle cultural practices that preserved identity amidst hardship. These voices existed in letters, in private journals, in songs sung softly in crowded kitchens, but they were largely absent from public memory. Native communities endured centuries of silencing. Their stories were rarely recorded in the way history deemed significant. Forced relocations, broken treaties, and cultural suppression erased not only land, but identity. Generations grew up in boarding schools that forbade their languages, punished traditional ceremonies, and so ought to replace indigenous ways of life with imposed norms. The historical record may note the existence of these policies, but it seldom captures the quiet anguish of families torn apart, the resilience required to maintain culture in the face of erasure, or the loss of entire ways of knowing. These silenced voices are threaded through the landscapes of reservation lands, oral traditions, and unspoken memories. African American communities in the post-slavery era also lived in a world where their voices were actively suppressed. The horrors of lynching, segregation, and systemic discrimination were often recorded only partially, if at all. Families mourned in silence, communities organized quietly, and individuals persevered under conditions designed to keep them voiceless. Personal narratives, diaries, and letters became precious repositories of truth, yet many were never published or preserved. The mainstream histories preferred to document the perspectives of those in power, leaving these ordinary, courageous lives almost invisible. Workers in rural and industrial settings across the country faced daily risks that history barely acknowledged. Coal miners, textile workers, and railroad laborers confronted dangers that could end lives in an instant. Accidents, explosions, and illnesses were common, yet official records rarely emphasized the personal suffering behind these statistics. Every individual lost was often reduced to a number in a ledger, a footnote rather than a story. Families grieved quietly, and communities adapted, finding resilience in shared hardship. These are the voice that history muffled, whose experiences illuminate the human cost behind economic development and national growth. Silenced voices also exist in the context of social and political struggles. Women fighting for suffrage, civil rights, or labor rights often labored in obscurity, their efforts documented minimally, their names left out of broader historical narratives. They organized quietly, educated communities, and resisted injustices without expectation of recognition. Their work built movements, yet official histories frequently highlight only the leaders whose names became famous, neglecting the countless others who formed the backbone of progress. These silent contributions remind us that history is not solely the story of the visible. It is also the accumulation of unacknowledged effort and quiet sacrifice. Even within families, stories were often suppressed. Children growing up in poverty, immigrant households, or marginalized communities learned to adapt, to endure, and to survive without drawing attention. Their resilience, courage, and suffering often went unrecorded, but their experiences shaped the fabric of communities and influenced generations to come. The narrative of history, focused on headlines, legislation, and prominent figures, rarely captures these intimate, human-scale experiences. Yet in their silence, these voices provide a depth of understanding that no textbook can replicate. The act of silencing does not always require intent. Sometimes it arises from convenience, oversight, or societal norms that determine which stories are deemed significant. In other cases, it is deliberate, to maintain power, to protect a dominant narrative, or to create a sense of national pride at the expense of uncomfortable truths. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. Entire communities and individuals fade into the background of history, leaving gaps that echo across generations. Listening to these silenced voices requires patience, empathy, and attention to the subtleties of life that textbooks overlook. It involves reading personal letters, oral histories, diaries, and local records, and it requires recognizing the humanity in what was ignored. By attending to these stories, we begin to understand not only the hardships endured, but also the courage, resilience, and creativity that allowed people to survive and even thrive despite systemic erasure. As the 20th century unfolded, the silenced voices of America did not disappear. They shifted, adapted, and persisted in quieter, less visible ways. While history often celebrates major wars, political milestones, or technological achievements, countless individuals and communities continued to live, struggle, and persevere outside the spotlight. Their stories are woven into the everyday texture of life, in homes, workshops, farms, neighborhoods, and fields, where labor, resilience, and hope carried on in the shadows. African American communities, for instance, continued to face systemic barriers throughout the 20th century, from Jim Crow laws to redlining, economic oppression, and political disenfranchisement. While the narratives of prominent leaders are well documented, the voices of ordinary citizens, the parents, teachers, organizers, and neighbors, often remain hidden. They endured harassment and discrimination quietly, yet their persistence created the foundation for broader social change. Every voter registration effort, community school initiative, or local protest represented acts of courage and resistance that history books frequently neglect. These silenced voices remind us that the fight for justice is not only fought on grand stages, but also in kitchens, classrooms, and community halls. Immigrant communities continued to face challenges as well. Waves of arrivals from Europe, Asia, and Latin America navigated hostile environments, often performing dangerous work in factories, farms, or construction sites. Their labor fueled economic growth, but their stories were often left untold. Children growing up in these communities balanced school, language acquisition, and cultural adaptation, while adults endured discrimination, grueling hours, and uncertain futures. Much of their suffering was private, recorded only in letters, photographs, or the oral traditions passed quietly between generations. These are the voices that history tends to silence. Why? Their persistence shaped neighborhoods, industries, and cultural landscapes across the nation. Workers in hazardous industries continued to suffer in silence. Miners, factory laborers, and railroad workers faced daily risks of injury or death. Mine collapses, chemical exposures, and workplace accidents claimed lives without making national headlines. Families mourned quietly, sometimes for multiple generations, while economic necessity forced others to continue laboring under unsafe conditions. These experiences were rarely included in official accounts, yet they were instrumental in shaping labor laws, unions, and workplace protections. The sacrifices of these individuals, often unrecognized, demonstrate the human cost behind the comforts and conveniences that society later came to take for granted. The voices of women were also frequently silenced. While suffrage movements, the feminist waves of the 20th century, and high-profile leaders are celebrated, the countless women who organized quietly, educated communities, and supported social change in small towns and cities often went unrecognized. Mothers teaching literacy classes, women running local political clubs, or volunteers assisting with civil rights campaigns contributed enormously to societal progress, yet history rarely records their names. Their work, while invisible in textbooks, was essential to the movements that eventually reshaped the nation. These silent contributions remind us that history is constructed not only by those in power, but also by ordinary individuals whose dedication seldom attracts attention. Even in the arts, culture, and science, silenced voices abounded. Artists from marginalized communities, inventors whose patents were ignored, and scientists whose contributions were overlooked due to race, gender, or class, frequently struggled for acknowledgement. Their work often reached small audiences or remained unpublished, yet it influenced the cultural and technological landscape in subtle but enduring ways. Understanding history requires listening to these contributions, tracing the faint echoes of innovation and creativity that traditional narratives overlook. Communities impacted by systemic oppression, Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants, and others, carried stories of survival and resilience that textbooks rarely include. These silenced voices offer a deeper understanding of societal development, how families adapted to displacement, how neighborhoods formed supportive networks, and how ordinary acts of courage sustained communities across generations. Every quiet decision, every act of resistance, every effort to preserve culture despite oppression becomes a thread in the broader tapestry of history. When we fail to record or acknowledge these threads, our understanding of the past remains incomplete. Silenced voices also emerge in moments of disaster or neglect. Natural disasters, epidemics, and social crises disproportionately affect marginalized communities, yet their suffering is often underreported. From the floods that swept through impoverished neighborhoods to the overlooked health crises in industrial cities, the lives of ordinary citizens endured quietly, often with little recognition or aid. These experiences, when recorded, often appear as statistics rather than as lived human stories. Yet in every figure lies a life, a family, a community, and a narrative that deserves acknowledgement. Recognizing these silenced voices requires intentional listening. It involves seeking out oral histories, diaries, letters, photographs, and personal accounts that were not deemed significant by mainstream historical standards. It requires attention to what is absent as much as what is present. The quiet courage, the small acts of defiance, the everyday resilience. These are the elements that make the past fully human. By recovering these voices, we deepen our understanding of the forces that shaped society, the injustices endured, and the hope that persisted despite adversity. These voices also teach us about the ongoing responsibility of memory. History is not static, it is continuously shaped by what we choose to remember, document, and pass on. When voices are silenced, the lessons they carry risk being lost. When we honor them, however, we acknowledge the humanity of those who came before, and we gain insight into the patterns of resilience, injustice, and courage that continue to influence the present. In many ways, the act of listening to silenced voices is an act of justice, an effort to restore dignity and acknowledgement to those who history overlooked. Ultimately, the voices that were silenced remind us that history is not only the story of events, legislation, or figures. It is the sum of human experience, both celebrated and ignored. Every individual who lived, suffered, persevered, and contributed in ways too quiet for the spotlight deserves recognition. By attuning ourselves to these overlooked experiences, we gain a richer, more compassionate understanding of the past. These voices, once muffled by circumstance or design, now emerge through careful attention, research, and storytelling, reclaiming their place in the broader narrative. As we reflect on these silenced voices, there is also a gentle lesson in humility. The narratives we inherit are partial, shaped by power, convenience, and societal norms. Listening to those who were ignored teaches us empathy, attentiveness, and the importance of questioning dominant narratives. It reminds us every life has value, every story has significance, and the quiet endurance of ordinary people often underpins the larger arcs of history. In acknowledging these silenced voices, we do more than restore forgotten chapters. We honor the resilience of humanity itself. From workers to marginalized communities, from women to immigrants, from ordinary families to overlooked innovators, these voices reflect the depth and complexity of human experience. They remind us that the past is not only made of triumphs and victories, but also of quiet suffering, perseverance, and courage. By remembering them, we not only recover history, we nurture a deeper understanding of ourselves and the society we inhabit. And so the silenced voices speak once more, not through headlines, textbooks, or monuments, through careful listening, gentle reflection, and conscious effort to honor those lives. They remind us that history is never complete without their stories, that every whisper in the shadows carries meaning, and that by paying attention to the quiet, overlooked, and hidden, we illuminate the full spectrum of human experience. These voices, once forgotten, now resonate, teaching us that every life, no matter how quietly lived, has shaped the world in profound and lasting ways.
History is often celebrated through the laws that define a nation, the policies that promise fairness, and the statutes that appear in textbooks as milestones of progress. Yet not all legislation brings justice or equity. Some laws, written quietly, deliberately, or with little public scrutiny, have left long shadows, policies that shape society in ways unseen, creating hardship that often took generations to recognize. These laws were not always created with cruelty in mind, but their effects were profound, and the harm was often inflicted on the most vulnerable. To understand them, one must look not at the headlines, but at the silence in the corridors of power, the decisions made in rooms closed to the public, and the consequences that stretched quietly across communities. Consider the history of property and land laws in America. Policies governing land ownership, zoning, and inheritance were written in ways that often excluded marginalized communities. Native Americans were displaced through treaties that appeared legal on paper, but ignored centuries of stewardship and connection to the land. Homesteading laws granted land to settlers while forbidding indigenous people from returning to territories they had lived in for generations. These policies were rarely debated publicly, and the narratives accompanying them framed settlers as pioneers while rendering indigenous resistance invisible. The long-term consequences of these quiet legal maneuvers are still visible today: land loss, economic disparity, and the erosion of cultural practices. Similarly, economic policies often caused harm quietly, without fanfare or public awareness. During the early 20th century, tax laws, banking regulations, and labor policies were enacted in ways that favored industry and wealth accumulation while disadvantaging workers and small communities. The consequences were not immediate for everyone, which made the harm less visible and easier to justify politically. For example, minimum wage laws were either absent or weak, allowing exploitative labor practices to flourish, while corporate loopholes ensured that wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Families endured hardships silently, laborers worked under unsafe conditions, and communities struggled under policies written without their representation or input. These laws, often drafted in private offices or legislative committees, quietly reshaped society. Criminal justice policies offer another example of legislation whose impact was long-term and insidious. Laws designed to control certain populations, through vagrancy statutes, drug policies, or sentencing guidelines, were often written with little attention from the public, yet they disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Policies that seemed neutral in language, such as mandatory minimum sentences or 3 strikes a laws, often created cycles of incarceration that trapped individuals and families for generations. What appeared to be technical adjustments in the law became deeply entrenched social harm, quietly altering the fabric of communities. The impact of these laws was rarely debated in full in public forums. Their consequences unfolded slowly, making them difficult to notice at the time of passage. Housing and urban policies also illustrate the quiet power of legislation. Redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and zoning laws were implemented in ways that shaped neighborhoods, segregated communities, and limited opportunities for generations. Maps, covenants, and legal codes were carefully drafted to appear neutral, yet the effects were profound. Entire neighborhoods were denied access to mortgages, schools, and economic development. These policies were rarely discussed outside local boards or banking institutions, and their long-term consequences, persistent inequality, underfunded schools, and concentrated poverty, persist quietly to this day. What may have seemed like technical or administrative decisions had life-altering repercussions for millions of people. Even labor laws, designed to regulate working conditions, sometimes carried unintended harm. Early legislation often excluded domestic workers, agricultural laborers, or public employees from protections afforded to others. These omissions were not always noticed by the general public, but they allowed exploitative practices to continue under legal sanction. Children, women, and marginalized groups bore the consequences, often for decades. When laws fail to account for the realities of daily life, their absence of protection becomes as harmful as active oppression, and the victim's suffering often goes unrecorded. The quiet nature of these laws is essential to understanding their power. Unlike violent acts or public scandals, harmful legislation often appears ordinary, technical, or procedural. Its drafting involves committees, bureaucrats, and lawyers, rather than dramatic proclamations. The harm is cumulative, unfolding slowly over years or decades. Families lose generational wealth, communities are destabilized, and opportunities vanish, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the silent, persistent application of rules that were never questioned by most people. This invisibility makes the harm especially insidious. Because it is not loud, it is easier to ignore, and those affected are often marginalized in ways that prevent them from being heard. Education policies have also been a mechanism for quiet harm. Curriculum standards, funding formulas, and district boundaries have often been structured in ways that favored privileged communities while disadvantaging others. Schools in marginalized neighborhoods received less funding, larger class sizes, and fewer resources, not necessarily because anyone intended to harm students, but because the legislation that distributed resources was written in ways that prioritized efficiency or local control over equity. The consequences, generations of students with limited opportunities, were profound and often invisible, quietly shaping life trajectories for decades. Healthcare policies, too, offer examples of legislation with hidden harm. Decisions about insurance, public health funding, and hospital access were often made quietly, yet they had life or death consequences for populations. Policies that limited coverage, excluded pre-existing conditions, or failed to fund preventive care disproportionately affected the poor, the elderly, and minority communities. These legislative choices rarely made headlines at the time, and the people affected often had no voice in the process. The harm was real, cumulative, and long-lasting, illustrating the quiet but profound influence of law when applied without public scrutiny or consideration for those most vulnerable. Beyond the obvious examples of land, labor, and housing, The 20th century and beyond reveal further instances of laws written in darkness, policies that quietly reshaped lives without the scrutiny of public debate. Immigration laws, for example, were often crafted in ways that systematically excluded certain groups while privileging others. Quotas, restrictive visas, and bureaucratic requirements appeared technical, even neutral, on paper, but in practice they prevented families from reuniting, limited opportunities for work and education, and reinforced social hierarchies. While the public discussion framed immigration in economic or security terms, the human impact, the hopes deferred, the communities disrupted, the dreams denied, was largely absent from mainstream narratives. Civil rights legislation provides another illustration of hidden harm. While the nation celebrated milestones such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the quiet policies that followed sometimes undermined their promise. Loopholes, selective enforcement, and local administrative decisions allowed systemic discrimination to persist. Policies governing voter registration, jury selection, housing enforcement, and public employment were often written in ways that maintained inequality while appearing lawful. The cumulative effect of these measures was subtle but profound, reinforcing patterns of segregation and exclusion. Even after the passage of landmark laws, communities endured these legal structures quietly, adjusting to the constraints imposed by rules that were invisible in their complexity but omnipresent in their impact. Environmental legislation, too, contains examples of laws written in darkness. Policies regulating industry, water, and land use were often created without considering long-term consequences for communities or ecosystems. Factories were permitted to discharge pollutants quietly. Zoning decisions allowed hazardous facilities to be placed near vulnerable populations, and oversight mechanisms were insufficiently funded. While the language of these laws often emphasized economic development or technical compliance, the human cost, chronic illness, contaminated drinking water, and degraded land unfolded gradually, largely unnoticed by those outside the affected communities. Decades later, the consequences of these quiet decisions became painfully evident. Yet at the time of passage, the legislation appeared mundane, even beneficial. Surveillance and civil liberties provide a more contemporary example of laws written in darkness. Policies governing government monitoring, data collection, and law enforcement powers are often drafted in technical language, debated in committees, and approved with minimal public awareness. These laws can have profound long-term effects, eroding privacy, disproportionately targeting marginalized groups, and consolidating power in ways that go largely unnoticed until the consequences accumulate. For the average citizen, the harm is invisible on a day-to-day basis, but over time, these quiet decisions shape the limits of freedom and the contours of public life. Even well-intentioned policies can cause harm when drafted without careful consideration. Welfare laws, public assistance programs, and social safety nets were often written with rigid eligibility requirements, bureaucratic obstacles, and punitive measures that unintentionally marginalized the people they were meant to help. Families navigating these systems faced confusion, delays, and barriers that reinforced cycles of poverty, while policymakers and the public remained largely unaware of the human impact. In this sense, darkness is not always malice. It can be the product of neglect, oversight, or the abstract way laws are written and interpreted, yet the outcomes are real, measurable, and often devastating for those affected. Education policies continued to shape inequality, quietly. Decisions about standardized testing, district funding formulas, school closures, and teacher assignments were often framed as neutral or technical measures. Yet these laws systematically disadvantaged certain populations, perpetuating cycles of underachievement and limiting access to higher education. For students growing up in underfunded districts, the impact was lifelong. Diminished opportunities, reduced mobility, and a subtle message that society did not value their potential. The harm was quiet, incremental, and pervasive, precisely the effect of laws written without transparency or public engagement. Healthcare and insurance policies illustrate another form of silent harm. Laws regulating access to care, coverage mandates, and reimbursement structures often favored the wealthy or those already well served, while leaving marginalized communities with gaps in care. Decisions about which treatments were covered, which hospitals received funding, and how public health resources were allocated quietly created disparities in outcomes. Prisons, once bustling with order and punishment, now stand empty, yet the air seems heavy with memories of confinement, despair, and resilience. Institutions built for care, education, or work often retain faint echoes of the people who passed through, leaving unspoken stories woven into walls, floors, and corridors. These are the places that hold unspoken memories, sites where time slows and the absence of life amplifies the presence of the past. Abandoned towns are perhaps the most poignant of these spaces. Across America, once thriving mining towns, industrial hubs, or farming communities were deserted as resources ran out, industries collapsed, or populations migrated. Streets that once teemed with children playing and shopkeepers calling out to customers are now overgrown with weeds, cracked with age, or swallowed by encroaching forests. Buildings remain as silent witnesses. A schoolhouse where generations learned their letters, a church where weddings and funerals were celebrated, a theater where families once gathered for entertainment. Each structure, each street corner, carries fragments of memory. In their emptiness, they speak of hope and hardship, community and loss, life and its impermanence. Prisons, too, carry a weight of unspoken memory. Long after the guards leave, the cells close and the gates are locked. The stories of the incarcerated linger. Some prisons were notorious for cruelty, overcrowding, and punishment, yet each inmate brought a unique narrative of struggle, survival, and identity. Graffiti scratched into the walls, worn steps, and echoes of locked doors hint at quiet acts of defiance, whispered conversations, and solitary reflections. For some, prison was a place of despair. For others, it was a crucible of resilience, a space that reshaped them in ways both painful and transformative. Abandoned cells retain these imprints, not as visible markers, but as a subtle resonance of countless human experiences. Institutions such as hospitals, asylums, and boarding schools also bear unspoken stories. Hospitals, places meant for healing, often witness suffering that went unrecorded in detail. Patients who arrived too late, lives ended quietly, or the weary hands of nurses and doctors striving to save the unsafe. Asylums designed to contain and care for those society could not accommodate hold memories of fear, isolation, and marginalization. Corridors that once echoed with voices now only carry the faint impression of footsteps and murmured conversations. Children in boarding schools, students in institutional classrooms, and residents in care homes all left traces of their presence, a quiet testament to the lives that passed through these walls. Each of these abandoned places carries a duality, absence and presence. They are empty, yet they are not lifeless. In the creaking of a door, the wind whistling through broken windows, or the rustle of grass overtaking a sidewalk, one can sense the lingering human energy that once animated these spaces. Time does not erase memory. It preserves it in fragments, in textures, in shadows. To visit these places is to step into a dialogue with the past, to feel the resonance of lives once lived, and to confront the quiet truth that human existence leaves traces long after it departs. Communities that once thrived in towns now abandoned often reveal both resilience and neglect. Families migrated, jobs disappeared, and life continued elsewhere, but the remnants of their lives remain embedded in the built environment. Photographs left behind in houses, a rusted swing in a schoolyard, a forgotten book on a library shelf, all whisper of ordinary moments that are now forever unspoken. The unspoken memories of these towns are not limited to tragedy. They also tell of celebration, love, and the mundane joys of everyday life. The challenge is to listen, to observe, and to honor the stories embedded in empty streets, cracked walls, and abandoned homes. Prisons and correctional institutions, while often associated with punishment, carry subtle histories of human endurance. Within their walls, countless stories unfolded, of friendships formed in adversity, of letters exchanged under strict supervision, of small victories claimed in confined spaces. Even after the inmates leave and the institution closes, these narratives persist in the textures of the environment. The worn floors, the scratched walls, and the silent echoes of voices that once filled the corridors. Each abandoned prison is a monument to both suffering and resilience, a testament to the human capacity to endure, adapt, and survive in even the most restrictive circumstances. Abandoned hospitals, asylums, and schools serve as silent archives of institutional life. These places witnessed routine care, extraordinary crises, and countless untold personal stories. Patients, students, and residents came and went, leaving traces that remain long after the buildings themselves fall into disrepair. The faint outlines of rooms, the peeling paint on walls, and the scattered remnants of furniture all testify to lives once lived, each with its own narrative of struggle, hope, and transformation. In these spaces, silence carries weight, and absence itself becomes a medium of memory. Visiting such places often evokes a strange sense of empathy. One begins to sense the accumulation of lives and events that history, newspapers, or records might have ignored. The stories of ordinary people, miners, prisoners, students, patients, or teachers, emerge not in written accounts but in the textures of space, in the layering of human experience that time has not erased. These unspoken memories form a subtle, immersive tapestry, offering insight into human resilience, fragility, and continuity across time. In many ways, abandoned places teach us to listen differently. They invite observation of subtle cues. The way shadows fall across cracked floors, the rust on an abandoned swing, the faint scent of age and decay in an empty hallway. These cues are a language of memory, a quiet testimony to lives that have left their mark in intangible ways. By attuning ourselves to these spaces, we can begin to understand the complexity of the past, not as a series of dates or events, but as lived human experience, layered, nuanced, and enduring. Beyond the general emptiness of abandoned towns and institutions lie countless specific stories, often overlooked, yet quietly profound. Take, for example, the coal towns scattered across Appalachia. Once bustling with the rhythm of miners heading to the pits and families tending gardens and schools, many of these towns now lie empty. Rusted rail tracks curve into overgrown forests and the wooden frames of houses sag under the weight of decades. In each home, remnants of life remain. A child's toy frozen in place, a photograph on a mantel, a newspaper scattered on the floor. The miners' struggles, the family's joys, and the small community rituals that once defined daily life are now preserved only in memory, whispered by the wind through broken windows. These towns are not merely deserted. They are archives of lived experience, silent yet brimming with stories waiting to be imagined. Prisons and correctional institutions, too, retain these echoes. Some closed prisons in America are notorious for the cruelty endured within their walls, yet each inmate brought a unique story of human struggle, perseverance, or even small triumphs. Letters left behind, graffiti etched into walls, or worn patterns on the floors reflect lives lived within strict confinement. In solitary cells, people whispered to themselves, wrote in secret notebooks, or made art from scraps, quiet acts of existence asserting identity in the face of erasure. When these institutions fall silent, these traces remain, demanding recognition of human resilience even in the darkest circumstances. Asylums and mental institutions hold perhaps some of the most haunting unspoken memories. Many of these buildings were constructed with intentions framed in benevolence, care, treatment, rehabilitation, but history tells a more complicated story. Patients endured strict regimens, isolation, and experimental treatments that were often inhumane. The echo of these experiences lingers in long empty hallways, in peeling paint, and in abandoned therapy rooms. Yet these places also contain narratives of quiet solidarity. Friendships forged in waiting rooms, moments of creativity amid restriction, and the enduring human spirit that resisted being fully erased. Walking through these spaces, one senses the weight of both suffering and endurance, an invisible archive of human lives. Abandoned schools and boarding institutions tell similar stories. Classrooms, once filled with chatter, lessons, and laughter, now hold a silence that is almost tactile. Desks remain in disarray, chalkboards faded, and hallways echo faintly with the footfalls of students long gone. In some cases, records, notebooks, and photographs left behind allow glimpses into lives once lived. Birthdays celebrated quietly in classrooms, friendships formed in hallways, or moments of hardship endured in silence. These unspoken stories are often ordinary, yet they are no less significant. They remind us that human experience exists not only in grand historical events, but also in the everyday interactions that shape lives and communities. Even religious institutions now abandoned carry layers of unspoken memory. Churches, synagogues, and temples that once resonated with prayer and song now stand in stillness, yet the echoes of devotion remain. Stained glass windows, worn pews, and faded hymnals testify to countless private moments of hope, despair, and reflection. Congregants came and went, children were baptized, weddings celebrated, and funerals mourned, all leaving subtle marks on the space. The building itself becomes a repository of memory, carrying with it the spiritual, emotional, and communal traces of those who gathered within. These spaces also carry cultural memory. For example, theaters in abandoned towns tell stories of entertainment and artistic expression, once central to community life. Audiences laughed, cried, and experienced stories together, leaving faint traces in worn seats, posters clinging to walls, and faded stage curtains. Similarly, libraries and reading rooms, long abandoned, preserve the quiet devotion of individuals seeking knowledge, comfort, or escape in books. In every creaking floorboard or sun-faded corner, these institutions silently document the lives of ordinary people who rarely make it into history books. Even the smallest objects in these abandoned places hold memory. A child's shoe tucked beneath a floorboard, a nurse's medical chart left in a drawer, a ledger from a local store. All become tangible links to lives that pass through quietly. These traces remind us that history is not only written in legislation, battles, or famous names, but in the intimate details of everyday life. In observing them, we honor the human presence that once animated these spaces, even if those individuals were never widely remembered. There is also a psychological resonance in these abandoned spaces. Visitors often report a sense of empathy, as if the walls themselves remember. Silence becomes a medium through which past lives are felt, a gentle echo of laughter, tears, and whispered conversations. The absence of life makes the presence of memory more palpable. It is in the creak of a floorboard, the wind through broken windows, and the shadows cast by decaying furniture that one can almost perceive the unspoken narratives woven into these spaces. Perhaps the most profound lesson of these places is that human lives are enduring even in their quietest forms. Abandoned towns, prisons, asylums, schools, and hospitals demonstrate that memory is not solely preserved in writing or monuments. It is embedded in the physical spaces we inhabit. Even when history chooses not to record individual lives, the built environment retains a quiet testimony to the collective experiences of those who came before. These spaces invite reflection, empathy, and a recognition that all human experience carries value, whether celebrated or forgotten. Finally, these unspoken memories remind us of impermanence and resilience. Communities rise and fall, institutions close, and buildings decay, yet the human stories they housed remain. Listening to these echoes teaches patience, attentiveness, and humility. It encourages us to notice what is often overlooked, to honor experiences that history may have ignored, and to acknowledge the enduring imprint of lives that passed through quietly. These places, though abandoned, are not empty. They resonate with memory, and by engaging with them, we become participants in a gentle act of remembrance. In conclusion, abandoned towns, prisons, and institutions are more than relics. They are living archives of unspoken human stories. They remind us that history exists not only in documented events, but also in the subtle traces left behind, waiting for careful attention to reveal the lives, struggles, and joys that unfolded there. By attuning ourselves to these spaces, we honor the invisible narratives that continue to shape the world, recognizing that memory endures even in the quietest corners. In listening to the unspoken, we ensure that these echoes are not lost but carried forward, bridging the gap between the past and our awareness today. History often tells itself in grand gestures. Wars, revolutions, treaties, and political shifts dominate the pages of textbooks and documentaries. The names of leaders, the outcomes of battles, the passing of legislation, these are the events most remembered. Yet behind every headline, every summarized paragraph, there are ordinary lives profoundly altered by injustice. People who had no control over the tides of history were forced to navigate circumstances beyond their choosing. Their stories are rarely told, yet they carry the deepest echoes of suffering, resilience, and quiet courage. Consider the Great Depression, an era commonly described in terms of economic statistics and government programs. While textbooks note the stock market crash of 1929 and the New Deal policies, they often fail to capture the human dimension. Families forced from their homes, children growing up hungry, and parents laboring tirelessly for scraps of work. In one small rural town, a baker might have closed his shop as flour became scarce, while a teacher worked in a crowded, underfunded schoolhouse, trying to provide education amid despair. These lives were ordinary, yet their endurance under extraordinary conditions is an essential part of the historical record, often hidden beneath broader narratives. Similarly, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is sometimes mentioned only briefly, yet it transformed countless everyday lives. Entire families were uprooted, losing homes, businesses, and communities. Children who had grown up in neighborhoods suddenly found themselves behind barbed wire fences in remote deserts. Parents worked in camps under strict regulations, while grandparents coped with isolation and fear. The hardships of daily existence, the long queues for food, the improvised schooling, the small acts of defiance and creativity, were largely invisible to the broader public. These were ordinary people living extraordinary injustice, their quiet suffering rarely memorialized beyond the acknowledgement of the internment itself. Labor strikes and industrial unrest provide another example of the overlooked human cost of historical events. When miners protested unsafe working conditions or textile workers demanded fair wages, the headlines might record the strike itself, perhaps noting the number of workers involved or the eventual settlement. Yet behind the statistics were families grappling with lost wages, children skipping meals, and communities threatened by violence. Husbands and wives worried about eviction, parents tried to shield children from trauma, and neighbors risked retaliation for supporting the cause. The lived reality of ordinary people navigating these events reveals a depth of experience that is rarely captured in standard accounts of history. Racial and social injustices are another sphere where ordinary lives were profoundly affected, but often overlooked. While laws and policies might be recorded in textbooks, the daily reality of living under segregation, discrimination, or exclusion is seldom explored. African American families in the Jim Crow South faced limitations in schooling, travel, and employment, which shaped their opportunities in daily existence. Every interaction, buying groceries, attending church, sending children to school, carried an awareness of inequality. Parents taught their children caution, resilience, and dignity, trying to preserve self-respect in the face of systemic oppression. These were ordinary acts in extraordinary circumstances, shaping lives in ways that extend far beyond what historical summaries capture. Even in times of war, the experiences of ordinary civilians are often compressed into casualty statistics or brief mentions of displacement. During conflicts such as World War I, World War II, and later wars, millions of non-combatants endured rationing, loss, fear, and separation from loved ones. In occupied towns, families hid in basements, children learned to navigate checkpoints, and parents carried the burden of survival under surveillance and threat. These experiences were not dramatic in the way battles or treaties are, but they were no less significant. Ordinary lives were disrupted in ways that were profound and enduring, yet they are rarely detailed in conventional histories. Immigrant experiences provide another lens on ordinary people confronting extraordinary injustice. Policies restricting immigration, workplace discrimination, and social prejudice shaped daily life for millions. Families balanced multiple jobs, children acted as translators, and communities developed informal support systems to survive. Their struggles, navigating bureaucracies, facing prejudice, and building homes in unfamiliar lands, were largely invisible in historical accounts that focused on legislation or waves of migration. Yet it was these ordinary acts of perseverance and adaptation that made possible the growth of communities and the resilience of immigrant populations across generations. Even everyday acts of injustice often left long-term effects that textbooks overlook. Housing discrimination, redlining, and exclusionary zoning created circumstances that shaped opportunities for generations. Families forced to live in under-resourced neighborhoods faced limited access to education, healthcare, and employment. Children growing up in these conditions carried the weight of structural inequality into adulthood, influencing life trajectories in ways that are rarely quantified in historical summaries. These were ordinary people living under extraordinary systems of injustice, their daily choices constrained by forces beyond their control. Healthcare inequities illustrate another realm, where ordinary lives experienced extraordinary consequences. Policies regarding access, insurance, and treatment often privileged some while neglecting others. Rural families, minority communities, and the poor navigated illness, injury, and chronic conditions without adequate support. The historical record may note improvements in medical practice or public health initiatives, but it rarely captures the lived experience of people waiting for treatment, improvising care, or mourning preventable losses. Each quiet struggle, though ordinary, reveals the profound impact of systemic injustice on everyday existence. In essence, history often prioritizes events over experience, leaders over ordinary lives, and outcomes over processes. Yet the full story of the past requires attention to those whose lives were most affected by injustice, but who had little power to shape the narrative. Their experiences reveal the human dimension behind events, statistics, and policies. By focusing on these ordinary lives, we can better understand how systems of power operate, how injustice unfolds, and how resilience emerges quietly, often unnoticed. The 20th century continued to produce events that, while often summarized in textbooks, had profound effects on ordinary lives. Consider the Civil Rights era. While history highlights landmark court decisions and famous marches, it rarely delves into the daily realities of those who lived under segregation. Families navigating separate schools, neighborhoods, and public facilities experienced small, cumulative injustices every day. Children learned caution from a young age, avoiding public spaces that could expose them to danger. Parents calculated the safest routes to work or market, constantly aware of discriminatory practices that could escalate into punishment or harassment. These ordinary decisions, repeated day after day, defined how people moved through the world. They reveal a life lived under extraordinary injustice, where resilience was a necessity rather than a choice. Similarly, women's experiences during the fight for gender equality often went unrecorded in mainstream histories. While textbooks may celebrate leaders or legislative milestones such as the passage of the Equal Pay Act, ordinary women navigating workplaces, domestic responsibilities, and social expectations bore the everyday weight of inequality. Many faced harassment, discrimination, or limited opportunities while striving to provide for their families. Their quiet perseverance, balancing multiple jobs, mentoring younger colleagues, advocating informally for change, was seldom documented, yet it laid the groundwork for the broader societal shifts that textbooks summarize. The personal sacrifices of millions of ordinary women collectively shaped a transformative movement, even if their names were never remembered. Immigrant communities in the mid to late 20th century also exemplify ordinary lives subjected to extraordinary injustice. Policies designed to limit immigration or restrict opportunities created barriers that shaped families' everyday existence. Children often became interpreters for their parents, balancing schoolwork with adult responsibilities. Parents endured low-paying, hazardous jobs to provide for families. Neighborhoods developed informal support networks, sharing resources, advice, and protection. The public record may note changes in immigration law, but it rarely conveys the day-to-day resilience required to survive and thrive in a society that often treated newcomers as outsiders. Environmental disasters and industrial neglect created another layer of extraordinary injustice experienced quietly by ordinary people. Consider communities living near chemical plants, mines, or industrial waste sites. Policies and corporate decisions often allowed pollution to accumulate, exposing residents to long-term health risks. Children grew up with higher rates of asthma or chronic illness. Parents worried constantly, yet daily life went on. School, work, meals, celebrations, grief. These experiences were seldom part of the public conversation until health crises or legal actions forced acknowledgement. Yet for the people living in these places, the injustice was immediate, cumulative, and unavoidable. Ordinary life continued under extraordinary conditions, shaping every choice and interaction. The prison system in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is another domain where ordinary lives experience disproportionate injustice. While the headlines might report crime statistics or legislative reforms, the day-to-day reality of incarcerated people, their families and communities is rarely explored. Children of incarcerated parents navigate schooling and social stigma. Spouses manage households and finances alone, often under economic strain. Formerly incarcerated individuals face barriers to employment, housing, and social reintegration. These experiences, repeated across millions of lives, illustrate the ongoing impact of policies and social structures on ordinary people whose struggles rarely make the historical narrative, but whose endurance shapes the social fabric of the nation. Healthcare inequities continue to impose extraordinary conditions on ordinary lives. Policies governing access to treatment, insurance coverage, and preventive care have disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Parents navigate clinics and bureaucracies while trying to care for sick children. Elders manage chronic illnesses with limited resources. Families experience the stress of hospital bills, inaccessible care, and uneven treatment quality. The public record may note healthcare reforms or policy debates, but the lived reality, the quiet strain and endurance of millions of families, is rarely captured in textbooks. These ordinary experiences reveal the ongoing cost of structural inequality in everyday life. Even natural disasters illustrate how ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary injustice. Hurricane Katrina, for example, is remembered for images of destruction and headlines describing government response. Yet the daily lives of displaced families, people struggling to secure temporary housing, children navigating disrupted schooling, and elders attempting to access medical care reveal the human dimension of systemic failure. Residents of under-resourced communities bore the brunt of both the natural event and the institutional response, living in conditions that made survival a daily act of courage. These experiences are rarely highlighted in mainstream history, yet they exemplify ordinary people confronting extraordinary injustice. In more recent times, technological and social shifts have created new arenas where ordinary lives encounter injustice. Gig workers, people facing digital surveillance, and communities affected by unequal access to technology navigate daily circumstances that are often overlooked. Policies regulating employment classification, data privacy, and broadband access may seem abstract or technical, yet they profoundly shape opportunities, security, and autonomy. Ordinary people must adjust to systems that were not designed with their well-being in mind, quietly resisting or adapting to survive. Their experiences continue the pattern of ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary forces, highlighting the persistent relevance of the theme across generations. Despite the hardship, one constant emerges: the resilience of ordinary people. Cross every example: economic collapse, internment, segregation, labor unrest, environmental neglect, incarceration, disaster, or technological change. Individuals and communities adapted, endured, and often found ways to preserve dignity. Families created informal support networks. Neighbors shared resources, advice, and care. Children learned skills for survival and compassion. These acts, though rarely recorded in history books, form the core of human resilience. Ordinary lives, though subjected to extraordinary injustice, continue to shape society through perseverance, quiet innovation, and mutual support. The lesson of ordinary lives and extraordinary injustice is that the human dimension of history is essential. While textbooks highlight major events, policies, or leaders, the experiences of everyday people provide the depth and texture that bring history to life. They remind us that injustice is not an abstraction, it is lived, felt, and endured. They also demonstrate that resilience, courage, and community persist even in the most challenging circumstances. By listening to these stories, we honor the human experience behind historical events, gaining insight into the real costs of injustice and the enduring capacity for hope. In reflecting on these lives, we recognize the need to remember history beyond headlines and summaries. Ordinary people bear the weight of extraordinary forces, yet their experiences are often invisible. Their courage, adaptation, and perseverance are a quiet testament to humanity. By acknowledging and exploring these stories, we enrich our understanding of history, gain empathy for those who lived through injustice, and ensure that the lessons of the past remain present in how we approach the world today. Ultimately, the stories of ordinary lives remind us that history is not only about events, it is about the people who experience them. Every act of endurance, every small resistance, and every moment of adaptation contributes to the broader narrative. Recognizing these lives helps bridge the gap between abstract historical forces and the lived reality of millions. Ordinary people may have been overlooked in textbooks, but their experiences were no less extraordinary, shaped by injustice yet marked by resilience, hope, and enduring humanity. History is not only shaped by what is remembered, but also by what is forgotten. Every time a story is left untold, every time an injustice is minimized or ignored, a part of the past slips into shadow. These silent chapters, the lives, struggles, and experiences often excluded from mainstream narratives, carry lessons that extend far beyond their immediate context. Ignoring them is not merely an oversight, it has consequences. When voices are silenced, societies risk repeating mistakes, perpetuating injustice, and overlooking the resilience and wisdom embedded in lived experience. Consider the history of systemic racial oppression. Textbooks often focus on landmark legislation or famous figures, but they rarely give space to the everyday experiences of those affected. Segregated neighborhoods, discriminatory employment practices, and unequal schooling created patterns of inequality that persist today. By minimizing these lived experiences, history gives the impression that injustice is resolved once legislation changes. In reality, the echoes of past policies ripple through generations, shaping access to wealth, education, and opportunity. Communities affected by these silent chapters continue to navigate obstacles that stem directly from historical neglect. Understanding the depth of these legacies is essential to addressing their modern manifestations. Economic inequality provides another example of why silent chapters matter. During the Industrial Revolution, child labor, unsafe factories, and exploitative wages were widespread. While history textbooks may note reforms or labor movements, they often fail to explore the human impact on children, families, and small communities. Generations endured hardship and deprivation, shaping patterns of poverty that persist today. When these experiences are left unrecorded, society loses the context needed to understand contemporary disparities. Policies implemented in ignorance of these past injustices risk replicating harm under new guises. Recognizing and remembering these silent chapters provides a crucial lens through which modern inequality can be addressed. Immigration history offers another lesson in the importance of acknowledgement. Immigrant communities frequently face discrimination, restrictive policies, and social exclusion. While history may briefly mention quotas or internment, the daily lives of those affected, the children balancing school and household responsibilities, parents navigating hostile workplaces, and families separated across borders, are rarely explored. These silent stories show how exclusion shapes opportunity, resilience, and identity. By understanding the human consequences of past policies, societies can better craft legislation and social practices that prevent the repetition of historical harm. Environmental injustice is similarly shaped by silent chapters. Industrial pollution, displacement of communities, and unequal access to resources were often ignored in the past, leaving ordinary people to endure long-term consequences without representation. When these experiences are excluded from historical narratives, societies may fail to recognize patterns that continue today. Communities living near industrial zones, chemical plants, or waste sites often face disproportionate health risks, echoing the neglected lessons of past policy decisions. Remembering the lived experiences of these communities is not merely historical, it is preventative. It helps societies avoid repeating patterns of neglect and injustice in modern environmental policy. Even wars and conflicts illustrate why silent chapters matter. While textbooks recount battles and treaties, the daily experiences of civilians, displacement, hunger, fear, and survival, are often overlooked. Refugees, families left without resources, and children forced into labor or military service embody histories rarely documented. Ignoring these narratives reduces history to abstractions of strategy and outcomes, masking the human costs and lessons embedded in lived experience. When the past is reduced to numbers and dates, societies lose insight into the conditions that perpetuate suffering and displacement, increasing the risk of repeating mistakes in future conflicts. Healthcare and public health crises highlight another dimension. Pandemics, lack of access to care, and discriminatory medical practices often affected ordinary people more than the powerful. When these experiences are left out of historical narratives, society underestimates the long-term effects of inequitable healthcare systems. Modern policy decisions that ignore historical inequities risk reproducing similar harms. The silent stories of patients, caregivers, and communities provide critical guidance for building more equitable, resilient healthcare systems today. Education, too, demonstrates the danger of ignoring silent chapters. School closures, underfunded districts, and unequal access to resources historically limited opportunity for marginalized groups. Textbooks may highlight legislation or reform movements, but the lived experiences of students and families navigating these barriers are rarely detailed. Failing to remember these experiences obscures the roots of educational inequities that persist, making it easier for similar injustices to recur. Understanding how ordinary students experienced exclusion and disadvantage can inform policies that prevent repetition of historical neglect. Ultimately, these silent chapters matter because they connect past and present. When history is incomplete, society is left vulnerable to repeating injustices under new names or contexts. The lessons embedded in human experience, resilience, adaptation, suffering, and resistance, are critical for creating societies that learn from their past rather than repeating its mistakes. By acknowledging and reflecting on these overlooked stories, communities gain insight, empathy, and guidance that informs decision-making, social justice, and public policy. The silent chapters of history are not merely remnants of the past. They continue to influence the present in subtle and pervasive ways. Communities that endured systemic oppression, whether through discriminatory laws, environmental neglect, or social marginalization, carry the consequences into today. Generations grow up navigating structural obstacles created decades, or even centuries before, often without understanding the full origin of their challenges. These lingering effects reveal that ignoring past injustices does not erase them. It allows their consequences to persist, often in forms less visible but equally impactful. Consider housing and urban policy. Redlining, restrictive covenants, and uneven investment in infrastructure systematically disadvantaged communities of color. Decades later, the economic and educational disparities created by these policies remain, shaping access to opportunity, healthcare, and generational wealth. Many families continue to live in neighborhoods with underfunded schools, limited public services, and higher exposure to environmental hazards. The history of these decisions is rarely acknowledged in popular narratives, yet their effects are felt daily. Without remembering these silent chapters, policymakers risk repeating similar patterns under new terminology or in different contexts, perpetuating cycles of disadvantage. Environmental justice provides another critical example. Communities historically excluded from public decision-making often bore the brunt of industrialization and urban development. Mines, chemical plants, and waste sites were placed near marginalized neighborhoods, exposing residents to pollution and health risks for decades. While broader history might mention industrial expansion or regulatory milestones, it seldom conveys the lived reality of families affected by toxic exposure. These stories highlight the necessity of including the voices of ordinary people in shaping contemporary policy. Ignoring the historical record allows governments and corporations to repeat past errors, placing new generations at similar risk. Immigration and refugee experiences also illustrate the importance of remembering overlooked histories. Policies that once uprooted families or excluded entire communities left patterns of trauma adaptation, and resilience that continue today. Children born into immigrant families often navigate dual worlds, honoring the culture and struggles of their parents while integrating into a society that may still harbor bias or structural barriers. The stories of earlier generations inform these experiences, providing both context and lessons. If these histories remain silent, society risks repeating policies that marginalize newcomers, treating them as outsiders rather than as vital contributors to the social fabric. Civil rights and social justice movements reveal another dimension of this principle. While public history celebrates victories like landmark legislation, it often glosses over the everyday risks, struggles, and sacrifices made by ordinary people, activists facing arrest, families enduring economic retaliation, and communities organizing quietly against entrenched injustice. These silent chapters remind us that systemic change is rarely immediate or obvious. When these stories are ignored, society may underestimate the effort required to protect civil rights, potentially allowing complacency to erode hard-won progress. Learning from past silences is essential for sustaining justice in the present. Even within healthcare, silent histories matter. Historical disparities in treatment and access, particularly for marginalized communities, shaped generations' health outcomes. Segregated hospitals, discriminatory medical practices, and uneven public health initiatives left scars that persist today. Modern healthcare policies that overlook these histories risk reproducing inequities in subtle ways. Understanding the experiences of ordinary families navigating illness under unjust systems provides critical context for creating equitable and inclusive healthcare solutions today. The echoes of past neglect warn us that progress must be conscious and deliberate, rather than assumed. Economic policy, too, demonstrates the enduring relevance of silent chapters. The experiences of workers during periods of rapid industrialization, economic depression, or market collapse were often minimized in historical records. Families faced lost jobs, evictions, and hunger, their daily struggles summarized in statistics rather than lived stories. The cumulative effect of such neglect created patterns of inequality and limited social mobility, lessons that remain relevant for today's policymakers. Recognizing these silent histories allows modern leaders to understand the human consequences of policy decisions, helping prevent the repetition of avoidable hardship. Even cultural memory itself can be shaped by omission. Marginalized voices, from indigenous communities to women, immigrants, and minority groups, have often been left out of mainstream narratives. By failing to document their experiences, society risks creating an incomplete understanding of its own history. These omissions allow injustices to persist unexamined and can normalize patterns of exclusion in the present. Conversely, actively uncovering, preserving, and teaching these silent chapters fosters empathy, awareness, and accountability. It equips current and future generations with the perspective needed to resist repeating harmful practices. The broader lesson is clear. Silence is never neutral. What is left unspoken in history shapes perception, policy, and social consciousness. Ignoring past injustices allows them to persist in new forms, while acknowledgement provides a pathway to understanding and prevention.
Ordinary lives affected by extraordinary circumstances carry lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the human cost of systemic neglect. By bringing these stories into the light, society gains insight into both the failures and triumphs of the past, guiding decisions and attitudes in the present. Ultimately, remembering these silent chapters is an act of responsibility. It ensures that the lives, experiences, and struggles of ordinary people are recognized, honored, and learned from. It reminds us that history is not only about grand events or celebrated figures, but also about the quiet, lived realities that often escape documentation. Connecting the past to the present allows society to break cycles of injustice, creating space for empathy, reform, and justice. Ignoring these stories allows patterns to repeat, embracing them empowers change. In reflecting on these silent chapters, we recognize the interconnectedness of past and present. The injustices endured by ordinary people, whether economic, racial, environmental, or social, continue to influence contemporary life. The lessons embedded in these experiences, if remembered and acted upon, can guide societies toward fairness and resilience. By attending to the voices previously silenced, we not only honor the past but also protect the future. These stories are not relics, they are warnings, guides, and reminders of our shared responsibility. In conclusion, the silent chapters of history matter profoundly because they shape the world we inherit. Every untold story carries consequences, both subtle and direct, that ripple across time. When we acknowledge these experiences, we gain clarity about injustice, insight into resilience, and guidance for avoiding repetition. To ignore them is to risk complacency and repetition. To remember them is to cultivate awareness, empathy, and accountability. By connecting past silences to present realities, we honor those who suffered, learn from their experiences, and create a more just and conscious society.